Hello, everybody. I was recently a guest on the Archetypal Tarot Podcast alongside Nicole Schnackenberg. We spoke about body image from a spiritual and mythical perspective, talking about the soul's relationship with the body, the hero's journey, films such as Labyrinth, and we even got into a bit of Game of Thrones. Now, even if tarot is not your thing, the Archetypal Tarot Podcast is one of my absolute favorite shows on, well, all out, but specifically on mythology and symbolism. And if you are into tarot, the hosts Julienne and Cyndera have done a complete course on the symbolism of the Major Arcana. So I can't overstate how much I enjoyed recording this, and I hope you enjoy listening.
The Archetypal Tarot Podcast, provocative mythology for the 21st century.
This episode is a conversation about archetype and body image with Nicole Schnackenberg and Richard Cox. Nicole is a psychotherapist, yoga teacher, a director of the Yoga in Healthcare Alliance, a trustee of the Body Dysmorphic Disorder Foundation, and she is the author of False Bodies, True Selves, Moving Beyond Appearance-Focused Identity Struggles and Returning to the True Self. Richard is a student of non-dualism and runs groups and individual sessions exploring consciousness. He hosts a podcast looking at the intersection of spirituality in therapy. He's also developed a program called Unbreaking the Mirror to explore a consciousness-based approach to engaging with body image distress. And if that weren't enough, he's also a long-standing patron of this show. And here's our conversation about archetype and body image and so much more. Hello.
Hello, Julienne.
Hi, Richard.
Julienne.
Hello, Nicole. Thank you guys so much for being on the show. I think this is a really great show to start our new year off with, because I think it's a big time after New Year's. People are reflecting on things in their lives, maybe things that they want to find out about themselves, things that they want to change, and just the nature of change itself, because we've got a brand new year. So I'm just chuffed that you guys are going to be on the podcast for this. And Richard, now you and I have known each other for a bit now, and you're a patron of the show. Thank you for that. Super excited to have you on. So you and Nicole have been working together for a while, and a lot of what you're doing, better than that, why don't you just explain kind of an overview of what the two of you have been working on together with people?
Okay, thank you, Julienne. This is actually one of my absolute favorite shows, so I'm delighted to be here. For the past couple of years, Nicole and I have been running an online support group looking at spiritual approaches, particularly to body image dissatisfactions, people who are deeply unhappy with their sense of physicality. We are more encompassing than that. We are more widely inviting that. So people, for us, the core thing is the spirituality and the form of suffering that manifests into, the absence of that manifests into, is a kind of secondary thing. But we are at the same time centered. We have been centered around body image, and that's a monthly group. And we've also been I've been running a study for the past this year, looking at offering people one-to-one sessions around that. The idea being, the idea we were both working on independently prior to meeting each other, was that a lot of human suffering is a kind of unanswered spiritual question, a kind of spiritual quest that isn't seen in that context. And what people are really asking underneath more superficial questions about how do I look, is my appearance okay, are deeper questions about, am I lovable? What really is the nature of a human being that makes us lovable? If my body is aging, if people have a paranoia about aging, that can mask deeper questions about, I'm descending into death, where the body is falling away. What meaning does life itself have if it ends in death? So what we do is offer a platform where people can explore whatever's going on for them in that slightly deeper, more spiritual context. A lot of that isn't necessarily mythic. It can be more on the kind of Advaita or Zen, kind of pure, looking into the consciousness at the center of one's being side of the spectrum. But also it can very much go into myth and look at how people understand each other through mythic archetypes and shape-shifting into things like witches and monsters, and how these feelings within us express ourselves, and the unloved, unknown shadow aspects, how they present themselves. So that's an overview, really, of where we're at.
Fertile ground there for sure. And so, Nicole, tell us a little bit more about how you came to this and a little bit more about the programs that you and Richard are working together. I'd love to hear a bit more about your kind of story and what you're bringing to this.
Thank you, Julienne. So I've come to this line of work and this interest through my own personal experience. So I've got lived experience of pinning my sense of identity and particularly my sense of unlovability onto my physical appearance. And that started in childhood, really, probably quite early childhood, although I didn't have words for it at that time. I didn't really understand what was happening. But it was in the context of being born into a family that had experienced some trauma, both on my mother and father's side. And therefore, being the eldest, being a much longed for child, and feeling that somehow I wasn't lovable as I was, I suppose, that there was quite a lot being processed and worked out through me. And the way I made sense of that was, well, perhaps as I perceived it, perhaps I'm being treated as the naughty girl, or perhaps my sense of myself is of the bad person in the family because of the way I look, because I couldn't really understand what other aspect it might be, because I was trying very hard to be good and doing very well at school and all the rest of it. So I thought, well, it must be the way I look that's making me difficult to love. So then that led to, in my early teens, beginning a struggle that ended up being diagnosed as anorexia, and that led to some inpatient treatments and some outpatient experiences as well. And whilst helpful, especially things like the family therapy and art therapy, I'm beginning to explore a little bit and unpick a little bit why I was starving myself. Still, I came away from all of those experiences in terms of the medical model of addressing my distress with the sense of, well, you know, I am a bad person. I am despicable in a sense, but I just have to learn to live with it. I have to push those feelings away, those feelings of ugliness and low self-worth away, and just get on with my life. And I suppose that's what I did. And I feel very sad to report that certainly in the work that I do with other people, that often that is the result, if you like, or at least part of the trajectory of people's experience, that they somehow pin their self-worth onto their appearance, they play that out, they realise that kind of isn't going to get them anywhere very fast or very far, and so they kind of push that down and try to just get on with life as best they can. But that underlying sense of worthlessness and unlovability remains. I guess at some point, I came to the realisation that there was also another opportunity there, that I could live the rest of my life denying my sense of ugliness and denying my sense of unlovability and just kind of living with it. Or I could do the opposite, which is something I'd never tried and was terrified of, to be honest, which was to turn around and face it and to kind of dive into that sense of ugliness and to be with that sense of unlovability and say, do you know what? You're welcome here. I will embrace you, in a sense. And feeling like that would be the end of things, really thinking that would probably send me mad. And then I connected with Richard and found that he was thinking about things and exploring things in a very similar way. And us deciding, look, let's see how we can share this with people. Let's see if we can support people to go to those darkest places and see if there's some jewel, some gem to be found in amongst those ashes, if you like.
Brilliant. I mean, you're essentially talking about the Jungian, what the Jungians call shadow work, where you go deeply into those. And it's, don't go there by yourself. It's kind of like going into a bad neighborhood. Take someone with you. So I think it's just brilliant that the two of you have come together to do this work. A quick question. So you have an online support group. Are you also doing presentations and working with people in person?
I'm working with people in person online. We do presentations whenever we're asked to. And I mentioned earlier, we've been running a study this year. So what prompted us to get the group going, just as Nicole was saying, we noticed like great transformational effects for the better in our own lives from engaging with life and our own sense of being from this perspective. It had opened up doors in our own minds and wider lives for us, and we wanted to make that more widely available. But also it's a bit pioneering too. It's not as other people have done it, of course, but it's something that's really emerging into the world in a lot of ways at the moment. So there is an exploratory aspect, okay, if we're looking at what's the potential for this. We know what potential it had for us, but what is the potential when it reaches other people who maybe, at least to begin with, aren't thinking this way? Okay, when we're trying to at least open that possibility for them. Look, you could look at what's going on for you in a different way. So that with the group, what we started doing earlier in the year was Nicole and I worked on producing a study, which I then ran and did sessions with people to document before and after effects of, if people have 6 sessions based around meditation, self-inquiry, looking within, posing philosophical questions to themselves, getting to the deeper questions, and also looking at things in terms of archetype and mythic image. What effect would that have on someone over that initial period? Would it open up a doorway for them that allowed them to then have a kind of foundation to investigate their lives in a different way? Not that it would lead to a complete cure of whatever's going on for them, but it would set them off on a hero's journey, if you like, because they would have the context to see what was going on as a hero's journey, as opposed to just a terrible thing that they were a victim of.
Right. It's the victim's journey in many ways, archetypally. There's what happens to you, and then there's what you do with it, what are your reactions to it. But I think what I'm hearing is a big part of, especially the initial value, is that recontextualization that I think many people, because they're unconscious or they're only partly conscious of early traumas. And I think that probably would be something that has to start in childhood, or has to start very, very early on, because it's at a, it will happen at a pre-rational place in your life. And that's typically, you're a small child. You don't understand, what actually is happening around you or to you, but you will, I think humans just naturally internalize things. If this is this, then that means I'm unlovable. And that's, we are just so tender when we're young. We don't have, unless we have brilliant people around us who are paying attention to us and reassuring us and really relating to us. And, most parents are probably too busy, I think, a lot of times, and don't, you can't get into the mind of a child. But if there's a certain kind of attention that you pay to, watching children, what are they interested in? And again, when clients who've had small children, they want to know what the archetypes are in their child. And I'm like, well, pay attention to the cartoons they love, or to the games and things that they like. And that will, bring forward sort of those ideas, those archetypal shapes that either are internalized within them or they're dealing with. And
massively.
I don't imagine that it's, I think it's going to happen to every kid. There's going to be some difficulty that comes up, whether it turns into a body image issue or not, but it is something to be worked with. That's language that I think I've used for years and years of talking about trauma and issues. It's you make it more of a part of what you deal with in your life. You work with it versus you battle against it, because a battle's going to end in death, right? It's always so. And in some cases, that death can just be the your inner monster. So I'm really interested in hearing a little bit more about the process that you take with clients, but also kind of the mythological. There, earlier conversation, we talked about the witch and the monster. In what ways are you kind of talking about these? Do you actually use stories? Do you use stories in your process? Or do you ask them to find stories that appeal to them or scare them? What does that look like in working with story, mythology, and archetypes with your clients?
Nicole, I know you've written about this. Do you want to?
Yeah. Well, I completely agree with you, Julienne, that it can be really interesting to look at what drew people in their early childhood in terms of the fairy tales and the mythical creatures. You know, what was it that they were fascinated by? And it was interesting to me to remember in my adulthood that I absolutely loved the story of the Snow Queen. It was my favourite, and I would read it again and again and again. And I could remember the last part of the story, but when I returned to it as an adult, I was almost had the breath knocked out of me reading the first part, because it was all about how the trolls had made this mirror, and this mirror it hid all the positive aspects, but it highlighted all the so-called negative or difficult or disgusting aspects of the person. And the trolls were so delighted with this mirror, you know, and how successful it was, that they decided to take it up into heaven to make total fools of the angels. And on their way up, this mirror gets smashed into many, many pieces, and it falls down to earth, and it falls into some human being's eyes. And whoever's eyes the pieces of mirror fall into, so their eyes take on the characteristic of that mirror, namely, they can only see the terrible and the difficult aspects of other people, and they lose sight of all those positive parts. And I just thought, wow, you know, that's exactly what I've been doing in a sense. I've kind of lost sight of all of the light within me, all of the positive aspects, and I'm only able to look into the mirror and see something abhorrent. And then also thinking to myself, then, you know, what is it that the trolls represent? What is it that the mirror represents? Why is it that, in my story in particular, it came to be pinned on the mirror reflection and not something else? And certainly when I'm working with people around this, I ask them to think about what stories drew them in, and ask them to reflect on, firstly, to go back to those stories, because I think often the most pertinent points aren't necessarily the points we remember, and maybe there's a protective factor in that. But secondly, you know, what might that reveal about their current experiences? But also, what might it reveal about the possible reconceptualization of their experience? So it also really resonated, Julienne, when you were speaking about how childhood trauma is often pre-verbal by its very nature, especially if it's extremely early, and therefore we don't necessarily have the words to put onto it, but that somehow then that gets put into metaphor, whether that be the metaphor of ugliness, the metaphor of the witch, or put into the metaphor of something else. And then how do we respond to that metaphor, and then somehow get to the pre-verbal experience through that metaphor? That's definitely something I'm really interested in exploring with people.
Yeah, and it reminds me of, I'm a fan of, I enjoy reading a lot of the Jungian writers, and James Hillman worked, because there's generally in psychology, and I would say since probably the 60s, 50s onward, the trajectory around the wound of the inner child, and then, you know, for a time, and I think we're almost sort of pulling out of this a little bit, but that psychology was all around the original wounds in the child. I don't think James Hillman kind of presented a little bit of a backlash against that, but I think it was pretty well misunderstood. But essentially, you know, the idea of, all of your problems are rooted in your childhood. And then, you know, kind of going out from that, I think there were missing pieces on the whole in psychology. But what Hillman was trying to say is those early childhood wounds, the wounded child in us, are also really, really important, because they are a doorway with which, if you pass through them, you work with it to, what did that original wound also give you in terms of what the gift. And he talked about his book called The Soul's Code, which essentially said, these horrible, you don't have to live the rest of your life as a victim of, I can't do this in my life because I was wounded as a child. And it all kind of comes back to, oh, horrible parents or whatever that sort of general idea was. He said, this is useful. This is pointing your soul. These wounds needed to happen in order for you to go and, basically live your soul's path to do what you did. And he cites many kind of amazing artists and thinkers and people who went on to do great things, but they probably wouldn't have had they not had that sort of original sin, that original wound. Where I really enjoy his philosophy because it no longer puts you as a victim. It moves you more towards, it provides a trajectory to become the victorious, which is kind of the way I language the two sides of the one archetype, victim to victorious. They really are one pattern. There's a pathology and a possibility essentially to those. So it's, I think, really, really important. And I love hearing that the two of you are working around something, especially specifically around body image. This day and age, there's like eras where you hear so much about, oh, well, we're really addressing this. And I think in the last 5-10 years, to me anyway, there's a lot of, the gnashing of teeth with social media and how everybody has to look perfect in their photos. But how to work with that. Like, we know why it's happening because everyone wants to find that beautiful part of themselves and show it to everybody. But the underlying root of how desperate people are to do that is something that we haven't yet really gone back to readdress. And I think the work that the two of you guys are doing is a part of that. Are you guys thinking at all? And this just occurred to me. So curveball, in terms of, are you working at all with people on any processes or exercises that they can do? I'm thinking of the selfie culture, of actual, I would imagine mirror work, but anything around how people are presenting themselves to the world on social media. Is there a relationship to that aspect in your work?
Well, just to pick up on you were saying about the core wounds, I think I'd be right in saying, Nicole, that we might conceptualize the core wound not so much as a bad event in childhood, but as a loss of connection with the true self. Okay, this, what you could conceptualize from a sort of perennial philosophy point of view of this infinite field of all-loving, all-beautiful consciousness in which all of us arise. We lose a sense of that and then we try to replicate it. We try to replicate that infinite beauty or to patch over it by having perfect selfies. Okay, and not accepting any kind of physical flaw. So I think it speaks to the problem in that sense of we haven't, I think, so much gone into a direct thing about selfies. Although by the time this comes out, we have just really done mirror gazing meditations. Okay, for how the mirror can be both something that's a terrible kind of victimizer of people and something you can feel a lot of misery inside. But again, you have this parallel to spiritual practices then, because a lot of spiritual practices involve mirror or eye gazing in some way. So there is this parallel. And certainly by the time this comes out, I've been working on making some of the meditations more publicly available, and they'll be up and out then of how to have a transformative experience through mirror gazing, how it can, rather than being stuck in a superficial sense of self in the mirror, it can be a gateway to that deeper sense then.
Right. So you're right. How do you deal with the ego, spirituality? And well, it's so funny. I think it's a question that I've not had large discussions around recently, but there was something that Michael Need said about the ego has the keys to the ashram. And there is a certain set of spiritual teachings that are basically get rid of the ego. You don't need it. The ego is edging God out and all of that belief. And myself, I mean, it was probably 12 years ago or more. I was like, yeah, get rid of the ego. And then, through life, I realized, you're not going to do that. And the working of the ego, like there is a place for the ego. I don't know that life allows us to become egoless, to longer have that sort of self-reflective, how we think of ourselves ego. But the social media has made it far more difficult to feel good about yourself because of, social media brings the ego to the fore. And what in a conversation I had somewhat recently, this is where I get confused myself. I'll admit that the spiritual, that feeling that you get when you see yourself really, really well presented in a photo, just like, and I question for myself and in conversations with other people is, am I seeing what's really, really true? Am I satisfying the ego to get it to step out of the way in order to get to the truth of the beauty of who I am? Do you know what I'm saying? Sort of like, it's like I have to satisfy the ego to get to this thing, but then any other part of the day when I'm not, my ego is engaged in telling me I don't look good. You know, that's what's the question of the truth. Like that best picture I've ever seen of myself, that's the real truth. That's the spiritual truth that satisfies the ego.
And I think, Julienne, a lot of this is really rooted in, again, things that are very deep and that we would have learnt very, very early on in our life in this body. So this idea that when we look at a selfie or we put a selfie up on Facebook or whatever it is, and it seems to be flawless and good, whatever that is,
right?
And we're pleased with it and other people are pleased with it, then that somehow maps onto, on a very perhaps unconscious level, that we must therefore be good and pure, which is of course what our soul knows itself to be in any case, which is perhaps why we strive after it, which again maps onto all these stories in childhood where the princess is flawless and beautiful and the monster, the witch, the troll is covered in warts and is bent over and has green skin and that equates with evil. So there's something very deep in the sense of, if there's something there that seems to be flawed, even the very classic baddie with the scar on his face, if there's something there that seems to be suggesting a physical flaw, then that must mean that there's something not quite right about my deeper self. Whereas our soul knows our true self to be completely pure and flawless, totally regardless of the appearance. So there's that real struggle, I think, with people. And there's that kind of dichotomy and that tangential understanding that we are not our appearance, and something like a scar or a blemish or whatever it might be doesn't mean we're bad people, side by side with this very deep sense that we've been fed perhaps for very many years, that perhaps it does suggest that we're bad if that photograph of us isn't good. And that's quite hard to unpick, I think.
I think you see this emerging as a cultural narrative. I get out of my depth when I talk about cultural narratives because it's very easy to make predictions about the world that are completely wrong. But when you see films like Shrek coming out, which sort of retell the Beauty and the Beast story, but where Fiona transforms into the ogre at the end, or you see witches being transformed. I think the first show was Bewitched that did it, but then they become good witches, essentially emerge into society more. I think there's a deeper current there. You see the same thing with vampire mythology. The vampires have gone from being the embodiment of evil and all things wrong to
sexy.
Sort of evil and all things wrong, but alluring and sexy.
Yeah,
so more and more alluring and sexy. And there's something that's going on collectively about the integration of the dark and the unacceptable. And I hope that's what it's reflective of. Julie, I'm sure you could say more about that, Julienne.
It's interesting. I've been kind of looking to see, what sort of like monster lore, is the next one, because vampires are over, zombies are still sort of around. I think right now we're really looking at superheroes archetypally, like in the now, 2018, 2019. That is I understand sort of the collective psyche is really bringing, not that they've gone away. We've always, at least, especially in the States, we have superhero movies coming out every year, but what we're seeing is groups of them, the group movies, the getting together, realizing we have to have teamwork, and it's really less about the single hero. I think the single hero idea is actually right now quite dangerous. When we look to a single person, that quickly becomes a dictatorship, which frankly is something that we're seeing, happening in the now. So just for, away from, looks and image, body image, that it's seeing groups get together, seeing the most recent Star Wars film, they're acting as a group. They realize they need to work together, and that it's always recognized that each one is very, very different from the other, but they're able to get together and work as a group. They have their individual skills that they bring to things. And then the narrative too, less with the superheroes, but you do see it in some superhero films like Iron Man, is what happens when you're defeated? What happens when the bad guy does win? And that in the last 3 years, we've seen more of that idea. And again, it's breaking down the hero myth, because the hero always wins, and you get this group of together, and maybe they don't. Maybe we don't end with that happy ending, but there's always a kernel of hope. There's always that plant growing through the sidewalk, showing us that, like, yeah, this is going to be even harder than you imagined kind of situation. Archetype.
Yeah, I think Game of Thrones was a big introduction to that for a lot of people. Like the day Ned lost his head, and that was. I'm sorry if I've just ruined Game of Thrones for anyone who hasn't seen it. The first
Spoilers.
Yes. Everyone knows that by now. And then worse things happen too, even worse things. But that was, the hero loses. And...
Yeah, but then Jon Snow gets brought back. So, we have our Jesus character. And again, that I think that is what will happen when you have superheroes on like demigods, right? And then you have the next level, which is the god or goddess type character. And Jon Snow very much is a Jesus character. He is risen from the dead. He is risen from the dead by the power of a witch. Thank you very much. Who basically sacrifices, her, essentially herself. She has to go away after that, but she does this, resurrection. So the Game of Thrones, I think, is a wonderful way to kind of look at collective, sort of what's happening, the bigger narratives, and this next season. And I haven't read the book, so evidently it's off book now. But that the idea of Daenerys trying to get back to the collective good, and the understanding of Jon Snow coming for where he comes from, really caring about the larger group of people rather than simply just power, is interesting and fascinating, and I find hopeful in a way.
The big question, I'll link this into body image in a second, I promise.
But it's fine.
The big question that hangs over the whole thing for me is, does it end in a big war with good versus evil where good wins, as in the war of ice and fire, the war against the ice zombies, or is the whole kingdom of Westeros requiring some sort of integration, like ice and fire have to be brought into balance some way? And I think you saw that when Daenerys' dragon went north of the wall, set fire to all the ice zombies. This is like victory through power, okay? And then it doesn't work because the ice guy's got an ice spear and it takes it out. So there needs to be a solution that goes beyond power and dominance. I hope that's where it's going. And I promise I'll make some effort to link that in. Going back to what you were saying about the ego and getting rid of the ego, I think, like, as a general comment on the way Nicole and I would approach this, we want to go beyond getting rid of any aspect of the self, really, be that the ego, the witch, the monster, because it's what arises in body image, where people talk in this very mythical language. They look into magic mirrors which transform them, even though there's a wider movement of seeing mental health in a very rational, reductionist way about brain chemicals. Actually, people, their lived experiences in terms of mythology, and transformations into witches and monsters, and I want to get away from the witch. Then, if I can get this witch, grab hold of that and chuck her out, whether that's through taking a pill or undergoing some psychotherapeutic process, then I'll just feel good. But what is the witch? What's the power inherent within that witch? If you stop fighting against her and open up lines of communication, you might find the bit of yourself you hate the most is the key to your empowerment and transformation.
And frequently is. Yeah. Well, it's funny. The witch, the archetype of the witch, I haven't really written a great deal about it, especially recently, but there's so many ways to look at it. You could do a whole podcast about it, but there's kind of the billboard explanation. The witch is basically the unowned feminine. I think of the witch trials, and it is the patriarchy basically demonizing women, and women who have a power that they don't understand. So witches themselves are essentially healers. They're shamans and they're healers. So you can apply those other archetypes to the, but they also they have the knowledge of the occult, the hidden. They're a priestess in so many ways. And so the witch, in terms of the witch trials and the demonization of the witch, means you basically have a doctor, okay? In modern sense, you have a doctor who understands a great deal of things and is there to help people and to cure them. But at a certain point in time, that was threatening to essentially the patriarchy, or people who were in charge, and then they must be gotten rid of, because the people who were in charge were also very deeply religious, and their way was the only way. So that had to be all shadow. So you had to burn the witches, you had to get rid of them, because it was a huge threat to their power structure. So that's in one way. And so you made them ugly, you made them evil, you made them want to eat children and bake them in ovens. And, it's so, it was a reaction, and you created the ugly part of an archetype and only talked about that and made them the enemy. And I think a little bit more, depending on where you live, that the witch still has this immense power, but they really are spiritual people. They are people who are dedicated to do no harm. I mean, that's the motto of Wiccans, of modern Wiccans, is do no harm. You wouldn't do anything to anybody else that you wouldn't want done to yourself. So they're still holding to the golden rule. And we do see, the good witch. It would be nice to eventually just see, the witch as she's an embodied human who has flaws, but also is, ultimately dedicated toward, connecting with the earth and what's magic, magic, however you want to spell it, with a CK at the end or whatnot. But that's, going back to the Druidic and Celtic roots of that. So there are witches, and many witches listen to this podcast.
And I think, if I may say, the way that you're talking there about the witch, and it's so fascinating to listen to you talk about it, you could also think about the medical model in that way, in terms of psychological distress, which the medical model would kind of label as a psychiatric diagnosis. And you could think about it in terms of, a person experiences something, and you could say that something is a healing something, in the same way that the witch is ultimately a healer. So there's something that occurs within the person that ultimately is trying to bring them back to a remembering of their wholeness. That's its purpose. But it's seen as this shadowy figure, because somehow it's taking that person outside of the norm, or it's causing them to behave in a way that in societal terms seems to be either aberrant or unacceptable. So, for example, in my own experience with the diagnostic label of anorexia, you could see that my journey into exploring how to move beyond my distress was ultimately a journey of hope. I was trying to move beyond the difficult experiences I was having. The manifestation of that to the outside eye seemed to be quote unquote evil. So we must get rid of the anorexia. We must get rid of the bad thing that somehow infiltrated you and is evil and wrong. But actually, that only seems to take us so far, because anything, as Richard was saying, anything we're trying to split off, anything we're trying to say is bad, anything that we're afraid of or demonizing, we're disowning a part of ourselves. And so that kind of inviting the psychological distress, truly inviting it in, truly listening to what it has to say, removing any sense of demonizing it, but rather seeing it as a portal into healing and as a portal into hope, gives a totally different spin on it. And I feel that's where we're a bit stuck currently, with the medical model versus other ways of exploring psychological distress. But it's also where we're seeing a bit more integration, perhaps, where we're seeing the medical model merge a little bit, and we're seeing practices where things like myth are brought into the therapy room. But again, I think it's a slow process. But
it seems like the stories, the mythology they live no matter what, and whether we're using them, whether we're reintegrating them. And again, I think the way you language that is brilliant, because at an archetypal level, we're moving more towards inclusivity, and that's the circle, right? So that is in many ways the feminine, but I always love, it's like the feminine belongs to everyone. It is not gender related. but in terms of it's relational, bringing the relational in with the agency model, which is the masculine of, diagnose, find, trap, remove. We realize that the path of agency, the path of healing, has to at some point turn from simply being an arrow moving forward to being a circle and being integrated. And so both are there. We're not chucking out the model of healing in terms of agency of doing it, but it has to include as it grows. And it's that the both and model where it really is a journey of integration and not simply making everything gray. And I think it's incredibly nuanced. And I think as people kind of evolve, we understand that nuance is important. And it's, not simply black and white. It's not simply making everything gray and you get lost in a puddle and everything becomes mixed together, but realizing that these pieces have to be a part of it. And a model of healing, and quite frankly, I think how we relate to each other. And again, to bring it back to Game of Thrones, which, Richard, we could do an entire podcast on.
Yes.
Is
Anytime,
that yes. Bring it on. Oh, our listeners would like that too. But that idea of, you brought it up brilliantly, because it's really easy to see the White Walkers as being, they're the monsters, right? They truly are the monsters. But what were they before they were White Walkers? They were humans. They were, all the other creatures. So, and guess what? They've been frozen and they're cold. And, the symbol of that is, there's no life in them. So I just find it really, really, really fascinating. And I think it would be interesting also with the witch to have a further reckoning of, I think, particularly Anglo or white people, to understand that we've had witches in our backgrounds. I live in Hawaii where there's healers and there's Hawaiian kahus and kahunas who heal, and the white people are like, oh, that's brilliant. And I'm like, yeah, okay, well, we burnt ours back on our
I'm laughing, yeah.
Right. It's funny. It's pretty easy to go to, a Native American healer and honor them, and want to learn that. And it's brilliant. I'm not certainly not against that, and studying shamanism and things like that. But I think I'm speaking as an Anglo person myself, what is the history of our witches? Everybody had, indigenous people had healers, and many women healers and leaders and all of that. So like that history is contained, and some form of internal reckoning or understanding that we all kind of come from that. And then that re-owning the witch in so many ways, and understanding that a monster is just a projecting out of what we want to reject and what we're afraid of.
And so many of the people that we work with, I guess you could say that they're projecting that inwards. So they are becoming the witch and they are burning themselves at the stake for it. They are the monster and they are slaying themselves, quite literally. It's kind of this, what is within and what is without. It seems to be played out in so many different ways. For a lot of the people that we work with, it's very much an internalized mythological experience, and bringing those aspects out into the light, if you like, looking at them, laying them before us, and reflecting upon those different aspects can be really, really helpful in that road towards healing and integration.
Yeah, and
that's
there are often
wonderful.
people who, that is beautifully put, yes, burning themselves. There are often people who have a more mythic sense within themselves, or a deeper kind of spiritual connection, and that's been not valued when they're children. And then they've internalized the voices that don't value it. So there's this conflict in them between the witch, the depth, the darkness is there, but you have a kind of, what you say about the patriarchal figure, I think of it as like the shadow of the Hierophant. I really love the podcast you did on the Hierophant, Julienne, is there, and blaming them for that. So you have a Hierophant in the mind, the critical voice is pushing that down. So it's really opening up conversations with that critical voice, finding out what it is, where it's come from, and how these two things can exist in balance. And indeed, I feel it in myself. I feel the dark, more out of control part of myself, out of control to the rational mind, the part it can't understand or get in touch with, scares it, right? And I and I can feel that in myself, and I can feel myself projecting that out onto other people in my likes and dislikes then. So it's really about becoming more in touch with that and allowing those parts to exist in harmony.
Important. Well, I love that you guys are doing this work, and our participants. So you got it's an online groups, and do you have people from the States? Do you have people from? Are people able to participate from wherever in the world?
Wherever in the world, and we vary the nights, so people in different time zones have a chance to attend, at least some of the time, and we do try and put it on weekends because it's in the evening for us, so earlier in the day for the States.
Right.
So yeah, if anyone, we do the body image group. I'm involved in a group around death, looking at that at the spiritual perspective too. So if anyone, we'll link to the information on that, and also the study. I think that I've got some of the people's feedback from the study up, so anyone who's interested can look at the kind of shifts that occurred through doing this work as it's documented now.
That's brilliant. That's lovely.
People are welcome to, if it's right for them, they can drop me an email and see about attending any of the groups.
Wonderful. Yeah, and I read a good bit of the study. It's fascinating, and I think part of it too is having kind of a structured forum, something that's very, very specific for people to work with these ideas is really important, because I think most people walking around who have, I don't think I know anybody who doesn't have body issues, especially as a woman, that I don't see a lot around specifically addressing the root issues of it. In the New Year's, you'll hear all about the latest diet and the latest thing and but the core issues are in a spiritual manner. I think that's really important to get and to have trusted partners that you're walking with, because again, the parts of the psyche are a bad neighborhood. Don't go alone. Bring someone who has a flashlight, the flashlight of spiritual sort of presence to be there with them. I think that's brilliant.
When you're talking about people coming together as a group, both currently in sort of the superheroes journey on film, but also people coming together to have that flashlight to not go it alone, makes me think about the beauty of the groups. People come together, they hear each other's stories, they often hear their own thoughts reflected out through someone else's voice. And then there is that sense of not being alone, but also that sense of being in community, which is so important. And that's where you get to that deeper level of these struggles, where we're not having, and it's understandable that these conversations happen in the new year and in general around diets and all the rest of it, because it's the capitalist society and the way we're kind of espousing what it is to be human on the broader level. But then to come together and talk about what that feels like, and perhaps even to begin to put that flashlight on what that might be about, in terms of who does that person feel that they are on the deepest level, what is that true self, what is their identity, is that the appearance of the body, or is that something else, and is that the struggle, is that why this is so painful? Because the biggest part of them, or if you like, the deepest true self part of them, knows that isn't who they are, and yet somehow they keep getting sucked back into it. So I do think it's the beauty of doing this work in groups, in addition to people having those kind of one-to-one experiences as well.
Lovely. Well, I think that's a brilliant way to wrap things up. So much to think about, and you're right. The beauty of the group being together, and to simply also at the basis point to remind people, where they were. I mean, that can happen in a therapeutic setting, but also in a group setting, to be able to remind people of who they are when they lose sight of it. And I think good friends can do that as well. But having it around a shared issue, a shared pathology, but also a shared possibility that goes beyond, I think, what a lot of other groups do around things like eating disorders. They have been very pathological, very like, here are the 12, you go through the 12 steps, and all of those things are good, but they still remain within a pathology, versus simply like one day you will graduate. Like, you never graduate from the 12-step group. But they're really embracing a larger possibility. And I think that's great. Thank you both very, very much for joining me in your evening in England and my morning here in Hawaii. It's been great. Mahalo, as we say here.
Oh, thank you. It's been fascinating. Thank you.
It's been a great opportunity to talk about this stuff, because we don't talk about the mythic element so we as much. We tend to talk about it more from a non-dual consciousness only perspective, and it's fabulous to have the opportunity to speak about the mythic.
Hey, happy to. We know you could have done something else with the last 45-ish minutes of your life, but we're so glad that you spent it with us. Links and more information about Richard and Nicole's work are in the podcast profile, which you can probably see right now on your phone, or you can go to the podcast page for the show. You can also visit deepstateconsciousness.com. And if you'd like to become one of our most favorite people in the whole wide world, become a patron. Just visit tiny.cc/tarot, and you too can be like these awesome humans: Sarah, Geneva, Richard, Peter, Rash, Ali, and Yvonne. Thank you. Your support makes all of this happen, and you make us smile every day. The show is produced by Both And Media, and the theme music is by The Lunar Group.